Please be seated. There are actually several Sundays where we have Psalm 23 as one of the texts, but I always love to preach on Psalm 23 on Good Shepherd Sunday because it is such a rich text. Most people know this text. It is almost always read at funerals, as it was yesterday at Jim Miller's funeral, and there is so much packed into it. So I want to just share some thoughts that came to me this last week on a particular portion of this text, and it is this is a part of this text that has always puzzled me because I wondered, what does that look like and what does that mean? And it's where the psalmist says, "You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil, and my cup overflows." This whole psalm is so rich with images that certainly any modern artist would relish it. Picasso, I think, would have made a very good work of this psalm. Can you imagine an overloaded dinner table positioned directly in front of one's worst enemies? And there it is, evidence that the contradiction still works. A banquet in bad company. Just this past Tuesday, I got a call from my cousin David telling me that his father, my Uncle Dick, died on July 4th. This news took me back 40 years when that same uncle betrayed his own brother, my father. At that time, my father was executor of his parents' estate, my grandparents' estate, which was very modest. Nevertheless, my Uncle Dick spread suspicion and lies to the other three brothers that my father was cheating them out of their inheritance. Now, as a 20-year-old at that time, I never dreamed that family members could betray each other in such an evil way. But looking back on it all, I realized that it was simply one more complication of life that I and my immediate family had to get through. The passing of time almost guaranteed it. And yes, more than enough time has passed for the betrayal to give way to something else. It's the banquet table. I could not have provided that banquet table. Only God could have done it. 40 years ago, when my father was betrayed by his own brother, an uncle that I had loved and trusted, I thought at times that the world had come to an end for me. And I know that sounds melodramatic, but remember, that's how I felt. I was 20 years old. That betrayal brought many feelings to the surface for me. I was angry. I was pained. I wanted to crawl into some warm womb once more for protection from the outside world. I avoided other people for a while, suspicious of friendships. And one of my primary emotions was revenge. I wanted to hurt the way I had been hurt. I wanted to get even. I wanted to settle the score. I wanted to see justice done for my father. And so I was not at all patient with God's timing. Indeed, I thought God was being entirely too slow. Where, in fact, was God? Why didn't God hurry up to get things back in order so I and my father and mother and my sister, we could get on with happiness and laughter in our lives? So in my own way, I tried to get even by writing a very angry letter to my uncle in an attempt to set some sort of banqueting table for myself. After all, life was to be lived somehow, wasn't it? And I would have to see to it myself. God didn't seem to be very efficient about the catering. Now, maybe you too might have dusted your heels through such sands. If you have thought that God left you, not trusting God all that much, then welcome. If you've dealt with blisters of the heart, believing some of them have even been inflicted by God, then welcome. If you have faced that awful loneliness of soul that comes when you reach out to touch the mystery of God only to feel that God has gone on vacation, then welcome. After all, you did not go away, did you? But in it all, interestingly enough, was God. At first, God wore a mask, which is God's privilege since, God is the author of humor and complex appearances. At first, God spoke in silence, which is also God's right, since God brings into being not only the clatter of our universe, but also the quiet of our universe. At first, perhaps God stayed aloof, which again is God's prerogative because God is everywhere, which allows for God seeming to be nowhere. Oh, and then you had your comforters. For even if you dared not speak, trying to hide your hurt and desire for revenge, some who were close to you detected it, and you had to deal with them as they dealt with you. With things like, well, why don't you pray? They would ask. Or, where is your faith? Or, I like this one, this too shall pass. Or, here's one more. Well, your dad must have done something wrong. After all, there's always two sides to a story. So the helpers were no help. And when you looked up for comfort, God did not seem to be any help either. Where was the real help that your soul desperately cried out for? And yet, as if on cat paws, God was setting up a table. The cloth, the napkins, the plates and cups and saucers and silverware, the candles. But most of all, the food. And of course you did not see it, nor did you hear God coming. But neither did Bethlehem when God was born as a human being. And neither did Jerusalem when Jesus rose from the dead that first Easter morning. But our hearing or seeing are not finally what count. What counts is that God is still at work, working the contradiction, preparing a table before our enemies. And more times than not even our faith makes much difference. If it did, we would, most of the time, not even get to a banquet. So what then finally brings that banquet? If it's not our ingenuity, if it's not our plotting, if it's not our stubbornness to have it our own way in a hurry, if it's not our faith or our lack of faith, then what brings about the banquet in the midst of enemies? It's the loving mercy of God. The God who came to us in the human flesh of Jesus of Nazareth, who said, I came that you may have life and have it abundantly. I recently told a friend, I've never been happier in my life. What did I say? Why did I say that? I have never been happier in my life. Was that me? Had I really thought through that sentence before allowing it to trip off my tongue? The happiest years of my life. Unbelievable. And I myself wouldn't have believed it when I was 20 years old, suffering with my father's pain of betrayal by his own brother. It was not within my faith to get hold of even a smidgen of that. And yet it was true. Through time, without my faith being even that strong at all, God set up a dinner table. And on it were blessings, more than I had ever dreamed could come my way at age 20. There was my marriage to Paul, who has been my partner, my best friend, my companion for 25 years. And we had a beautiful child, Katie. And there were friendships with new people. And the more names that my mind ticked off, the more I saw what a feast the Lord was laying before me. And on that table was the simple life. And how complicated the routine had become since I was 20 years old. But through the many betrayals of my life, beginning with that of my uncle 40 years ago, priorities began to be rearranged. And what dawned on me was the simplicity of everyday things. Flannel sheets on a cold winter's night. A piece of warm homemade bread fresh out of the oven dripping with butter. And my now adult child's surprising sense of humor and her passion for justice for those that others shun. But there was even more. The table was full, and one of the most precious foods on that table proved to be a more determined trust in God, knowing that God was present even when God seemed absent. And there also came to the forefront the conclusion that no matter what happened from now on, I knew God was at work for my good and for God's glory. So when I got a letter from a seminary classmate in which he said this, I have decided that regardless of the circumstances, I will not allow any of life's experiences to silence the song of praise and thanksgiving in my heart. I could identify with his words. And Jay's words were more than just a nice ending to a letter. Those words were a bedrock truth on which one could live and die. And yes, those words are true today, even in the face of the tragedies of life, like Charleston, South Carolina. My Uncle Dick has now joined my father in death. But I don't want revenge. Now I see him on the other side of that banqueting table with me. And I look forward to the day that I join him and my dad at that banquet feast that has no end. I could not have done that 40 years ago. It simply wasn't in me. And yet, without being aware, God was putting it in me as God prepared the table. Where is God when you feel betrayed, surrounded by enemies? God is there. God is setting the table. Can you believe it? If not, don't worry. What matters most is that you are God's child. Christ the Good Shepherd calls you by name. Can you hear Jesus' voice? God's loving mercy will see you through because Christ the Shepherd is holding you and walking with you through this time. Whether you can make out the form of it is not important. What makes the difference is our shepherd who goes ahead and prepares the banquet table. And in time you will see. In time you will sit yourself down at that banquet table and you will feed on this truth. That even enemies are not enemies after all. But instead, we are all fellow guests at the banquet table of God.